China considers itself at war with the U.S., and it holds the U.S. to rules it refuses to follow itself. So what can the U.S. do? Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Since the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party has been calling the United States its enemy. Top officials talk about fighting a war with the U.S. Not a boots-on-the-ground war, but economic warfare, propaganda warfare, media warfare. But even as the Chinese regime was saying this, the U.S. was focused on engaging with China, strategic cooperation. What will it take to get Americans aware of the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party? Joining me today is David Stilwell, the former top U.S. diplomat to East Asia. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during the Trump administration. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here, and I love the show, so it's a good chance to finally join you.
Oh, thanks so much. So, when you came on as Assistant Secretary of State, how was U.S.-China policy changing?
Well, I think by the time I came on, the Trump administration had already made significant changes to what in the past was a policy of trying to win them over and bring them along into recognizing that it hadn't worked. 40 years of trying hadn't worked, and so they took a more forceful approach. And so it actually fit my desires as well from my time in the embassy in Beijing and beyond to take a harder edge with the PRC and speak to them in a language they understand.
Well, I know while you were in that position, you called China a lawless bully. How did that go?
Well, I mean, again, diplomatic language doesn't have to be nice, right? It's just because diplomats can also use hard language. And if the language doesn't reflect the reality, then all of a sudden your credibility is shot. And so calling it what it is part of, you prefer to have those conversations in private, but if they're not having the conversations, if they're not going to talk to you, then you have to message them in any way you can. And in the public space is one option. So just calling it as it is. And look at the most recent example of the Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in response to the legal detention of Huawei heiress Meng Wanzhou. That sounds like a lawless bully to me, right? Hostage diplomacy isn't how normal diplomatic diplomacy is conducted. So,
yeah. Well, so was it frustrating dealing with your Chinese counterparts?
I got to say, it was frustrating in previous administrations. I was in military, so I've worked for every administration since Jimmy Carter. It was frustrating saying, hey, there's a problem here. We need to take a harder edge. And we weren't given one. And so my PRC counterpart oftentimes mocked me, when he says, well, it's just the way it is, man. And we're doing it this way and you have to be nice to us. Well, this is one reason I got back into government, happily retired here in Hawaii, as I saw that the Secretary Pompeo was taking what I thought was a very necessary approach to the PRC. And again, having a direct conversation in many ways clarifies our intent with the PRC. It's actually better than trying to be nice, because for all this time they've been wondering why aren't they reacting more forcefully. We would, why aren't they doing it? Well, we'd had enough after 40 years and said we're going to play. Unfortunately, we have to stoop to your level and play the game your way.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the idea of reciprocity that you've talked about.
Absolutely, and that comes from anybody everybody goes to the embassy in Beijing, Foreign Service, Defense Attaché, as panda huggers. We go, I can solve this. I see a way clear to do this. And everyone leaves the embassy a dragon slayer going, this is a problem. And we're going to have to take a harder position on this. So that colored my approach. And then having had real experience in the PRC, and looking at how badly they treated us there, and then looking at how well we treat their diplomats in the U.S., made that conversation with my counterpart very easy. Because I can say, we both know that you do this to us there, and you don't give us any of the same, and we yet give you full latitude here in the U.S. So, how are we going to rectify this? How are we going to make this more balanced relationship in the terms of that they use in their own language, in terms of the new type great power relations, right? Mutual benefit, mutual respect, no confrontation, and win-win. And yet they violate every single one of those. They're demanding that of us, but they're not willing to give it back to us. So I gave it back as much as I could.
And it was simple as you only had the fax number for Chinese officials? Like,
Yeah, I mean, the role of a diplomat is basic to maintain communications and share, make sure the messaging is happening. So when I went to Beijing, I discovered that my only way of, you know, reaching out directly to my counterpart was via a fax number. And I kept asking him, can I get your phone number at least, so when things go pear-shaped, we can at least talk about it and, prevent these things from, escalating. And they wouldn't even entertain the question. And so I ran into my counterpart in the U.S., and he had just scheduled a meeting here in Hawaii with his counterpart with a senior officer at the Pacific Command. And I go, how'd you do that? And the Pacific guy says, well, he just called us up. It turns out he had every DoD phone number, and he could call anybody he wanted. And oftentimes, in the spirit of friendship and the rest, his American counterparts would accept the invitations. So I asked him, I've got a fax number. You've got every phone number in the book. How is that fair? Why don't you guys allow me the same latitude? And he kind of smirked at me and smugly says, well, that's not our system. And they hid behind that. That's not their system. And so how do you respond to that? Well, you have to then match in the spirit of reciprocity. You have to try to match that system and deny them the same things, and then incentivize them to, give you what you deserve, and then, step by step build the relationship back up to where it should be.
Yeah, at least they should give you their beeper number.
Something. I mean, look, when accidents happen, when ships collide, when a Chinese fighter crashes into an American EP-3 is operating legally in international airspace in 2001, when this guy is clowning around, loses control of his airplane, and crashes into that P3, you've got to be able to reach out and talk to somebody to at least figure out what happened, and then make sure that neither side overreacts. And when I was there, I didn't have the ability to do that. You saw the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, attempted to reach out to his counterpart in the PRC early on to establish those conversation channels, and the Chinese refused. That is a significant problem, especially now as tensions rise in a relationship.
Well, speaking of China's military, officially China only has one overseas military base in Djibouti, but is that the reality?
Well, we know that here's the problem: is when they were a small middling power, the leader of the third world and the rest, they couldn't afford any of those things, right? As their interests grow, as their economic power grows, and as their need for things like energy and natural resources grow, they, of course, are incentivized to protect their lines of communication, right? If there's blockages, or if there's unrest or instability, if the Straits of Malacca close or whatever, that really affects their ability to do their jobs. We're seeing the energy problem in China right now due to the supply chain and shipping issues. And so it makes, to me, perfect sense that they would want to defend those. Remember, Djibouti began as our invitation to them to help with the piracy problem, because the piracy problem affected their shipping capability just significantly. And so they were incentivized to participate. The fact that they are looking to put bases in Sri Lanka and Cambodia and anywhere else they can find, they've got the port in Darwin. It makes sense to me, but that's not the narrative. They say only imperialists set up these coaling stations and all that, while doing the opposite. To me, that's a great advantage or an opportunity, as we can take the actions, put them against the words, show that disconnect, and then question their credibility. And credibility leads to legitimacy. So I think when their legitimacy is at stake, it will force them to make their words and their actions align better. Yes, we are building bases overseas because we have global interests. Perfect. Now, that's a repudiation of their long-term policy, of policies like non-interference in the internal affairs of foreign governments, which they do constantly here, and the fact that they are an imperial and global power. Just make the words align the deeds.
Well, if we want to talk about holding China to their word, they've been talking about invading Taiwan. Is the U.S. prepared for that?
One thing that we as Americans, and especially we in the U.S. government formerly, need to do is be more astute when we read Chinese language, because there is an outside voice and there's an inside voice. And the outside voice is all about threats and deterrence. And if a threat, when we make threats and we don't follow through on the threats, then I got to point to the Syrian red line as a good example of drawing a red line and then not following through. Your credibility, you feel like it's been damaged. But that's not how they work. In the PRC sense, if you threaten somebody 10 times and they back down once, that's a success. The other 9 times, the fact that you didn't follow through, that's not considered a loss. That's a break-even point. And it's the same thing with, as you mentioned earlier, global commitments or internal commitments. That Hong Kong being the most glaring, the fact that they, in the joint declaration, agreed that they would afford Hong Kong significant autonomy for 50 years, and in 23-year mark just walked away from that. And they called that agreement a scrap of paper. That should put everybody on notice as to how much stock you can put into the word of the Communist Party. If there's an advantage in walking away from an agreement, the damage to the reputation is not considered significant. And so, this is where Pompeo said, distrust and verify. That's got to be the new mantra for not just the U.S. government, but for all interactions with PRC.
Yeah, they're open about disregarding international agreements, and as you mentioned, hostage diplomacy. But I think the real question is, do you think the American public understands the threat of the Chinese Communist Party?
No, and that's been a huge frustration, is helping us get better at telling a story. The U.S. government, helping the U.S. government communicate with our own people better. It was endlessly frustrating that the best we could do is put out these bland, anodyne public statements. The Secretary of State says this. I mean, I guess we have to do that, but we've got to get smarter on utilizing, social media and media that my kids relate to get this message to the down to making it real to the American people. And so far, we've just trusted dumb luck. Bill Maher, or how do you pronounce his name, John Oliver, the NBA, the story of Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets simply tweeting, "I stand with the people of Hong Kong," and then the NBA losing all of its China revenue for a period of time, and then the response of some key NBA players who actually sided with the Chinese. That is really unfortunate. But the fact that dialogue is happening in the public, popular space is important, and I can't say enough about Enes Kanter basically saying enough, standing up, and yes, we make a lot of money in China, but isn't our self-respect worth more than that? And yes, let's talk about needlessly punishing a minority, the Uyghurs in China, and then all the other things. He's talking about Hong Kong now. Good for him. That's going to get this into the popular space where people are going to start asking questions like, "Yeah, what's that all about?" This show does that, right? You're using social media to help people understand what the real, what the Chinese Communist Party really does.
So do you think in the end the U.S. would be able to decouple from China?
Not entirely, but this is going to be a period of adjustment for the next 5, 10 years or whatever it takes to get them to treat us with the same respect they demand of us. And so, decoupling, I think, is an unfortunate word. It's a Chinese term that basically says, you can very neatly unplug the relationships and have an independent Chinese economy, an independent American economy. And it's not that, and it's by design. By design, it's this tangled mess. I compared it to 2 root balls. 2 trees have grown too close together, and their root balls are entwined. And if you want to separate those two, it's going to be ugly, and it's going to damage both sides, but it's necessary. You've got to, because the relationship isn't necessarily 2 trees. It's a forest of American trees and a invasive kudzu, that's a parasite that's choking out healthy American businesses through any number of ways. And the funny thing is, American businesses don't learn. They constantly go back to China because this is the market they want to get at. And the Chinese rules, mandatory joint ventures, makes it impossible for them to actually retain their own sovereignty. And they have to give up their intellectual property and all the rest, and soon leave China with their pockets outturned. As the President Trump said, it's the greatest illegal transfer of wealth in the history of mankind.
I think this gets at the heart of the issue. For 40 years, the U.S. got its China policy dead wrong. But it seems like a few years ago, even before COVID, that started to change. And, this was something that was across the government. Democrats and Republicans, people started to recognize the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. What do you think changed, and what is the next step moving forward?
It just took some over-the-top actions on the part of the PRC. Hong Kong in 2014 Umbrella Revolution didn't get that much attention from outside of government, but the protests of 2019 did, and those really started putting the problem on the, in America, people's laps. They started understanding why democratic Hong Kong is being squeezed like it is. The Uyghur issue, you compare Tibet to Xinjiang. I've never understood why we allow Tibet a pass. What Chinese activities in Tibet? It's the same guy, right? This guy Chen Quanguo, who we have sanctioned. I mean, he did his work in Tibet. He proved that you can kill your way to peace, and then he moved to Xinjiang and pretty much followed the same pattern. In China, Uyghurs are assumed to be terrorists. The fact that they're Uyghurs, based on their race, then they treat them like in Minority Report. Before they can commit their terrorist acts, we're going to suppress them, train them, and keep them from doing these things inside China. I think that's despicable, and I think that one resonated. American people finally understood exactly what we're talking about, both on the testimony of some Uyghurs who've been very brave because their families are being held in Xinjiang and being punished, activities that the Trump administration carried out with Secretary Pompeo at the General Assembly in September 2019, where we convened a sidebar event with 32 countries for Uyghurs who testified to the treatment they had. And then, of course, the pandemic. I mean, that's undeniable that they are responsible for that. These are things that have gotten people to wake up. And now, I said this, people say seeing is believing. The fact is, believing is seeing. Now the blinders have come off and people are starting to recognize, yeah, there really is a problem here.
And even as we're affected by supply chain issues, inflation, all of this goes back to coronavirus, the globalized supply chain tied to China.
Monopolistic, non-WTO conforming behavior in rare earths. The first hint of that was in 2010 when a Japanese or a Coast Guard ship, completely within its rights, arrested a Chinese trawler that had rammed it. And what was the Chinese response? They cut off or threatened to cut off rare earth metals to Japan, which would have crippled its electronic markets and factories. That was the beginning where people began to realize that China has kind of taken over a whole bunch of key industries, lithium for batteries and the rest. Again, awareness is all you need. I know awareness is the first step. And now people are aware we can start doing things. With our allies and partners and like-minded, there's nothing we can't do. 60% of the global GDP is represented by the US, the EU, and Japan, right? If we can just get those three on board, there's no problem we can't solve.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show and helping spread some of that awareness.
Thank you. Look forward to coming back.
Definitely. And thank you for watching. For more, check out the hour-long discussion Matt Shelley and I had with David Stilwell. That's on our podcast, China Unscripted. The link is below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.